Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Wednesday night Zoom. My name is Tennille Murray, and I'm the Community Engagement Director at AJ. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Indigenous Case for Israel with our guest speaker, Dr. Sheree Trotter. Tonight, we are discussing how Jews can work with other Indigenous peoples to defend our rights to the land of Israel. I'd like to make special mention to Roslyn from Queensland for organizing and helping us with this evening's Zoom. Dr. Sheree Trotter is a researcher, writer, and co-director of the Indigenous Coalition for Israel and co-founder of the Holocaust and Antisemitism Foundation, New Zealand. If you have any questions in the Q&A, I'll remind you, you can use the raise hand icon, which is at the bottom of your screen. And this is also being recorded on Facebook Live and will be replayed on J-Air tomorrow morning. So without further ado, thank you for joining us and welcome Dr. Sheree Trotter.
Thank you. Greetings, everybody. Kia ora koutou, as we say here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Great to be with you here this evening. So I thought I would start by just giving you a little bit of an introduction as to who I am and the journey that we've been on. As we've recently actually opened an Indigenous embassy in Jerusalem. And so that's part of the story that we want to share with you tonight. So Sheree Trotter is my name. I'm Māori New Zealander from Te Arawa tribe. Usually we open our formal introductions by talking about our mountain, our maunga, our waterways, our tribes. And that's our Indigenous introduction when we're introducing ourselves to new people. So I will just start with that and give a brief introduction to that. Ko no taha toku maunga, ko rotorua nui, kahumata momoe toku moana, ko Ngāti Whakauē, tūhaurangi, tapu ke Ngāti Moko, o ku iwi, ko Te Arawa, te waka, ko Sheree toku ingoa. So I've just explained to you that my mountain is Mount Nongataha. My waterway, which is a lake, is Lake Rotorua. And my iwi, my tribal affiliations, I have explained to you, the main one being Te Arawa, which is my canoe. And so for Indigenous people, this is how we identify ourselves with our mountain, with our waterways. Normally also we would start off with talking about our genealogy, and this also is an important part of indigeneity. But a little bit about myself and my husband, Perry. We've been on this journey with Israel and the Jewish people for about 30 years now. We're Christians, and so that's where our interest first started in understanding from the scriptures what was said about Israel and the Jewish people. And so that led us on a journey of learning and discovering. And there were a few key things along the way on this journey. And one of the key things, one of the experiences, which I think was quite informative for us, was that we had the opportunity to host Israeli travelers. And we had hundreds of Israeli travelers in our home. Of course, we have many Israelis who come to New Zealand after they have finished their army service and they want to get away from Israel and they go to the far ends of the earth. So they end up in New Zealand, beautiful New Zealand, experience our beautiful country. And so through this, we got to know hundreds of young Israelis, and it was such a special time for us in getting to know the people, having lots of interesting conversations and discussions and even arguments, getting to understand the mentality. And I really fell in love with the people in the land through the young people that we met. And so in 2008, we traveled to Israel with 3 of our children, and we stayed in the homes of many of these young people that we had hosted. So it was a beautiful exchange that happened. And then we got to experience Israeli culture firsthand. We had beautiful Shabbat meals and had celebrations with these families. We traveled for 2 months throughout Israel with 3 young children. So that was quite a journey in itself. And as part of that experience, we stayed on a kibbutz where we met Holocaust survivors. And my husband is a photographer, so we had the opportunity to photograph and interview these survivors. And we started a project which at the time we called Shadows of Shoah, where we curated these stories into short 3-minute stories because we saw the importance of wanting to communicate with young people the story of the Holocaust. And we came to Australia, to Melbourne, to Sydney, to Brisbane as well, and interviewed survivors there. And we've interviewed around 70 survivors in all. And so by 2014, I had started to become very involved with advocacy in New Zealand after the Gaza war, and saw that we had a problem with our narrative here and the way things were communicated, with our media being very biased, and with there being a lack of understanding of Israel's story. I also at the time went back to university to do my postgraduate studies and completed a PhD, which the topic was Zionism in New Zealand. So those two things side by side really gave me a lot of insight into the Jewish story. And so I began to be concerned with the way the narrative was being framed, and this idea that Jews were foreign white colonizers who had dispossessed the indigenous Palestinian people. I became concerned for my own indigenous people when some of our politicians, particularly one Maori woman politician, went to Gaza in around 2016 as an indigenous woman to stand with the indigenous women of Gaza. Now, I applauded for wanting to stand with the women of Gaza, but what concerned me was that there was this false narrative that was being promulgated. And so I started to think about how to respond to this. And so eventually, when I finished my PhD, I set up the Indigenous Coalition for Israel to provide a platform for Indigenous voices to be able to stand in support of Israel. And so as part of that, one of our goals was to establish an Indigenous embassy. And last year, when I was in Israel, I just saw a notice that you can't hear me. Is the sound okay?
The sound's okay.
Okay.
It's one individual who's got a problem. You can go to Facebook and pick it up as well.
Right. I'll carry on. And so last year I had the opportunity to go to Jerusalem, and I met with the Deputy Mayor, Fleur Hassan Nahum, and presented to her this idea of an Indigenous embassy as a way of really pushing back against this false narrative about indigeneity. And, we'd seen at the UN that time after time there was this effort to disconnect Jews from their Indigenous land. And so Fleur really loved the idea, embraced the idea, and she gave us the mandate as the Indigenous Coalition to push this project forward. And Fleur was very keen to have an event as quickly as possible. So a month later, one of my colleagues, a Maori New Zealander, went for an Indigenous conference in Israel, a couple of them actually, and found themselves meeting with Deputy Mayor Fleur as well, and again discussed this idea of an Indigenous embassy. And Fleur was very enthusiastic and in fact announced straight away the intention to establish an Indigenous embassy in Jerusalem. And so we worked towards an event, which we actually had in February. We had an opening event at the Friends of Zion Museum, an inaugural event. It was a wonderful event. It was a coming together of Indigenous peoples expressing their support and their love for Israel. We only had a small Indigenous contingent there because it was all organised very hurriedly. But I think it made a real impact. It made an important statement. We were there to show that Indigenous people stood with Israel. And so we had representation from across the South Pacific, from Hawaii, Tahiti, from New Zealand, from South Africa, we had Native Americans and First Nation Canadians people there. And as the evening unfolded, it was quite unexpected, but it became quite a celebration. The organisers of the event had brought along the Solomon Brothers to play the music, and as the music was played, of course, the Indigenous peoples got up and started to dance to the music, and the Jewish people joined in, and politicians joined in, and rabbis joined in, and we ended up celebrating together. So it was a very special time. So one of the recent things that happened was that myself and our co-director, my co-director, which is Honourable Alfred Naro, who's a Cook Island New Zealander who has served in Parliament with the national government here for about 9 years. We were invited to North America by Grand Chief Linda Prince. Now, there's an amazing story to that, backstory to that, which is that Grand Chief Linda Prince went to the Knesset in 1999 with a delegation of Native American chiefs, and they put on the table their desire for an Indigenous embassy. And so when Grand Chief Linda Prince heard about this embassy, she was so excited. She wanted to be there at the inaugural event, but she had some health issues, so wasn't able to make it, but she had a representative there. And so she invited us to come to a summit that she organized on a reservation in Seattle called Muckleshoot. We came together, she called together around 200 Native American chiefs and tribal leaders and grand chiefs, and we introduced the embassy to them. We had a wonderful celebration, in fact, and it was a wonderful opportunity to begin to connect with the First Nations of America. And so, you know, this is one of the goals of the embassy, is to build this international coalition of Indigenous peoples across the world who will stand with Israel. And one of the amazing things, of course, for us was to see that there's this long history of a desire for an Indigenous embassy from Indigenous peoples. And it was so special to be part of that. And there were actually a group of about 8 to 10 people at this summit who had been there in 1999 at the Knesset when they had put on the table their desire for an embassy. And so we took a photograph to capture that, you know, because that really is a piece of history. And there was also a New Zealand connection, a Māori connection to that original story, because this movement was part of the World Christian Indigenous Peoples Movement, which was started in New Zealand. And Linda Prince tells the story of the Māori leader who started this movement called Monty Ohia. And when Linda Prince brought to this people's movement the desire to include the Jews as Indigenous peoples of the movement, there was evidently quite a bit of pushback. There was a bit of anti-Semitism. There was a bit of replacement theology in the mix. But this Māori leader, Monty Ohia, stood with Linda Prince and stood firm and supported her in her desire to include the Jews as Indigenous peoples. So Linda Prince really paid homage to Monty Ohia, this Māori leader. So it was really wonderful for us as Māori from New Zealand to be able to go and connect with First Nations there. And so while we were there, we appointed an envoy for North America. Grand Chief Linda Prince, of course, was the obvious person to take that role, as she has already for 25 years been developing this network of people, educating her people about Israel. And we were able to start to do the things that we're hoping to do as an embassy. We went up to Vancouver and we met with the Jewish leaders of Vancouver. We went to the synagogue that had recently been attacked, and we made a statement. Grand Chief Linda Prince made a statement from that Vancouver synagogue in support of the Jewish community. And then we went over to Toronto and we were able to join the march, which consisted of 50,000 people, which was an amazing experience for us. But as an Indigenous delegation, we were part of this march, and we met with the consulate there, who had brought together Indigenous and Jewish leaders for a powwow session, and apparently this was a first for them. And so this was something that we were able to do as an embassy, is to provide this platform to bring together these leaders from our communities to begin to talk about allyship and how we work together to stand against the anti-Semitism, which is becoming such a concern worldwide. And we had other meetings while we were there. And so this is what the Indigenous Embassy is set up to do. It's set up to show an Indigenous global support for the Jewish people in this great time of need. And what we're currently working on is a grand opening event for the embassy, which is to take place in October. And we're encouraging our Indigenous peoples to come up to that event as a show of support for the peoples, to bring their dance, to bring their music, to bring our cultural expressions to stand in support of Israel. We're also planning to have an academic conference. And this is something that I think is really important because what we've seen is that a lot of the anti-Israel, the false narrative, should I say, has come from academia. So if I can just touch on that. We've seen this development over decades of this false narrative of settler colonialism, which paints the conflict in Israel in a very black and white way of Jews being colonizers, of Palestinian being the dispossessed peoples. And of course, as most of your audience will know the history, this is simply not true. And this is why the Indigenous argument is so important, that we get across the idea, the understanding that actually the Jews are the Indigenous people of the land. And so I'll just take a few minutes just to go over some of the fundamentals of what indigeneity means and why the Jewish people should be considered the Indigenous people of the land. And I'm going to show you, screen share in a minute, a resource that was shown to us in Canada by a group there, and I'll just bring it up. So we met in Canada the Allied Voices for Israel, which is a new group that's recently formed, I think after the 7th of October, of a wonderful young team, Daniel Corrin and Leah Bloom, who are leading this group. And they've put together this great little booklet, which I think is a wonderful resource. It's quite brief, and it's sort of at a very consumable level, which I think will be really helpful, useful to hand out to people. So they've given us permission to publish this on our website, and people are free to print it out and to make use of it. So I wanted to draw your attention to it. And it's also a very useful way just to go over the basics of this idea of indigeneity. What does being Indigenous mean? And so while there's debate really about indigeneity, and there's no set formulation of indigeneity, but there has been a set of criteria established, which is a useful guideline, and this has been put in place by Jose Martinez Cobo for the United Nations. And so there are around 5, there are more actually, but a number of traits which describe indigeneity. And these are a few of them: occupation of ancestral lands, or at least a part of them; common ancestry with the original occupants of the lands; culture in general or in specific manifestations; religion, living under a tribal system; membership of an Indigenous community; dress, means of livelihood, lifestyle, etc. Language, only language, mother tongue, habitual means of communication at home, in the family, or as the main preferred habitual, general, or normal language; residence on certain parts of the country or in certain regions of the world. So how does the Jewish presence in Israel stack up? The first one is occupation of ancestral lands, or at least part of them. So the Jewish people have been a distinct and identifiable group and have had a significant presence in the land for the last 3,000 years. And we know that there have been many attempts to colonize the land, the Greeks, the Babylonians, the Romans, the Assyrians, which have all come and gone. But I think, the fact that there is such a strong archaeological kind of footprint in the land, it's irrefutable evidence of that continuous connection in the land and occupation of the land. And this continuous connection idea, the fact that there's always been a Jewish presence in the land, even though the Jews were kicked out by the Romans 2,000 years ago, the majority of them, not all of them, there were some that stayed there, and the Jewish presence has been there all along. And I think that's a key factor to keep in mind when we're talking about indigeneity. This is quite a useful quote. Judaism is a land-based agricultural religion. We have had a spiritual and stewardship relationship with the land of Israel since the beginning of our collective memory. Land relationships and stewardship is a critical foundation for any tribe's indigeneity. And this connection to land is a key point when we're talking about indigeneity. And as I introduced myself with my mountain and my waterway, for Māori, land, connection to land is important. And it's the same for the Jewish people as well. When you think about, you know, your religious practices, they're all connected to the land. And I find that a useful definition to keep in mind is that indigeneity is about the development of a people in a particular land, about your culture, your literature, your language, your practices being connected to a particular land. And for the Jewish people, that land is Israel. That's the land where language developed, where literature developed, where your practices developed. So it's a key part of indigeneity. Common ancestry with the original occupants of the land. And so you'll hear people talk about, or what about the Canaanites? Well, first thing is the Canaanites are no longer around, so it's really not an issue. And also, you know, people will say, well, Abraham came from elsewhere. Well, I can say the same about Māori. Māori came from elsewhere. Everybody came from elsewhere. But for Māori, it was in this land that we developed our distinctive culture as separate and different from other Pacific nations. And so while we brought aspects of the Pacific here, what developed in New Zealand and Aotearoa was unique and uniquely developed in this land. And so it's the same for the Jewish people in Israel. So I think that is nicely pointed out in this quote. All people ultimately come from somewhere else. What makes a people indigenous to a place is their having become a people in that land and having all the earmarks of a unique culture associated with that place. And so, again, for Jewish people, that happened in Israel. Culture. Examples: religious prayers recited by observant Jews 3 times per day call for the return to Israel. Virtually all synagogues around the world face towards Jerusalem. The traditional phrase at the end of the Passover Seder. These are all ways of just showing that even if you're not religious, it's not the point. The point is, as part of your culture, these are practices that have been developed and over all these centuries. And this is all affirmation and evidence of your people as indigenous to that land. And of course, language and the resurgence of Hebrew is such a wonderful example of decolonization. And really, that is an inspiration to other indigenous peoples like Māori, who, even though in the last 20 years we have had a resurgence, and we now do have young people who are fluent in the language, it's still not an everyday language. We're not there yet. There's certainly a strong effort towards that, but there's a way to go. And to think that, you know, at the beginning of the 19th century, Hebrew wasn't the spoken language in Israel, but it is today. It's quite miraculous, really. And these are just some examples here of various historians who affirm the presence of Jews in the land from as early as the 20 BCE with Apion, who was a Roman historian who spewed anti-Jewish hatred. And yet even that is affirmation of that Jewish connection to the land. And of course, you'll know about Josephus, and then we have other Muslim sources that all affirm that connection to the land. And so that's just to give you a brief kind of overview, and I'm sure you probably will have lots of questions about that. But to sum up, that's what we're doing with the Indigenous Coalition for Israel. We have a lot of big goals and dreams for the Indigenous Embassy. We're hoping to appoint envoys in every part of the world, in different continents and nations where there are Indigenous people. And we want to have, at the moment, we have a residence, we'll call it a temporary residence at the Friends of Zion Museum, who have graciously given us access to their premises. We're looking for our own space to set up the embassy, and that's one of our goals going forward. And what we would hope to see is that we will have an Indigenous from the nations representative in Jerusalem at all times, probably on a rotating basis throughout the year. And that's something that we're working towards. So I'll leave it there and hand it back to you and take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. We might cut to our David Adler. I just can't see him in the...
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, no, there. All the raised hands have come in my view. David, please take it away before we head to our Q&A.
Okay. Just very quickly, as we always do, at the end of the event, everyone here, please do something to support AJA. Go to the website, jewishassociation.org.au. Make sure that you're following our social media for the frequent updates, usually multiple times a day, the best and most comprehensive news as to what's happening in the Australian Jewish community and Israel, of course. Next week, we have another very, very special guest. It's time for a strategic military briefing, and we will have with us next week Major General retired, because the retired generals can speak more openly than the serving generals, Giora Eland, and he was the former head of planning for the Israeli Defence Forces. So you won't find a more qualified authority to deliver a high-level military briefing for us, and that happens next week, and I don't need to tell you about the importance of that at the moment. Just to preempt before we get into the general questions, Sheree, I've already seen a few comments about wanting to gain access to that document you've shown. It does look useful. Specifically, how can we do that? Can AJA have a copy to distribute to our members? What's the best way to proceed?
We will be putting it on the website in the next day, so keep an eye on the website. And we have two websites now. We have the Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem website and Indigenous Coalition websites. But I can also send it to you as well. I can send you the links if you want to distribute the link.
That would be terrific. Okay.
We have online tonight Barbara Miller, the head of the Indigenous Friends of Israel. Barbara, would you like to say a quick couple of words? I know apparently your video is not working, but just on your voice. I suppose we'd have to unmute.
You need to unmute, Barbara.
Thank you so very much. And look, I just think it's wonderful, Dr. David Adler and the others for hosting this. And it was wonderful to listen to Dr. Sheree Trotter. We actually have her speaking for the Indigenous Friends of Israel International on the 19th of August. But we so applaud what's happening with the Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem. It's been on our heart for many years. In fact, we were involved with Monty O'Hare right back in, I think it was 1996, when he had this on his heart, and Grand Chief Linder as well. So it's wonderful that Dr. Sheree and the Honorary Alfred Naro have brought this to a head. We very strongly have the point of view that the Jewish people are the indigenous people of Israel, and it is a false narrative that the Jewish people are occupiers and colonialists. And one of the reasons we formed back in 2017 was specifically to counter that narrative, and that Israel is an apartheid racist state. So these are the kind of things that we are particularly focused on, challenging that false narrative and standing with the Jewish people.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It's great to see what our community is doing and all the wonderful things that we're doing out there. We'll head to the Q&A. I'll remind everybody, if you have a question, please use the raise hand, as they can often get lost in the chat. You don't have to put your video on if you're shy, but it does help us if you click the raise hand button. We'll start off with Leon. Would you please unmute? Leon.
Yes, Dr. Trotter, thank you very much for your presentation, and I applaud and salute you for the work you do and your groups do. Do you think that one of the problems that we, the Jews, have is that the common perception is that the modern state of Israel was established in 1948, and so many people who should know better think that it's a state that arose out of nothing, out of the Jews were suddenly parachuted in there to form a state, whereas there does not seem to be an awareness that actually a very large proportion of the Arabs who describe themselves as Palestinians, many of them are actually very recent arrivals in the land of Israel. And there is plenty of historical evidence to indicate that. And of course...
Leon, do you have a question?
My question is that, do you think that one of the strategies that we should use is, as well as indicating that there is copious evidence for Jewish indigeneity, there's pointing out to people that there is also plenty of evidence for the non-indigeneity of a large proportion of the Arabs who call themselves Palestinians.
Yes, well, I think that's part of rectifying the history, and how you do that is a matter of strategy and the order that you do things. I think our initial aim is really to strengthen the notion of Jewish indigeneity and bolster that so it becomes an undeniable reality for people. I've been discussing this evening actually with a professor from Jerusalem, an academic conference that we're planning to have. This year it'll be a symposium, and then we'll work towards full conferences where we will tackle these issues and go in depth and have the debates and the discussions and build a repertoire of material that we can all draw on to really strengthen our knowledge in this area and our arguments in this area as well. Thank you, Leon.
Alan Friedman, I think you're next.
Alan,
Yeah.
yep.
Yes, thanks. Firstly, Sheree, thank you so much for your work. My question's a little bit of a follow-on from the previous one. One of the bugbears that I have in this whole discussion is the use of the word or the term Palestinian rather than Palestinian Arab, because the term Palestinian was originally a geographic description, not a cultural one. And I think that by continually using the word just Palestinian, we add some legitimacy to their cause, which I don't think they're entitled to. Is this something that you've thought of, or would you think about it? And do you have any comment about that, please?
Well, I guess what we see with nationalism and its development is that these things do shift and change with time. And so we've seen since the 1960s, this development of a group of people who are now calling themselves Palestinian. Their identity really has been forged in opposition to Jewish nationalism and to the state of the nation of Israel. So in my view, I don't think there's a lot of value in trying to deny that there's now a group of people who call themselves Palestinians. It could be said, for example, for Maori, that once there was not a people called Maori, but they developed as a people in connection to the land. And you could apply the same for Palestinians. But I suppose my thinking is that we need to be strategic, I suppose, about which battles we fight. And for me, that's not one that I would place a great emphasis on. I would rather to spend the energy in really strengthening the idea that Jews are, in fact, the Indigenous people of the land.
Thank you. I did forget to mention, and I know Robert and Dr. David will pull me up on this, our policy at AJA is no comments, only questions. So please make your questions nice and snappy. And with that, Maurice, would you like to ask your question, please?
Hi, Dr. Trotter. Since the opening of the Indigenous Embassy Israel earlier this year, the 100th embassy, I believe, in Israel, what reaction and support has there been from other Indigenous communities around the world? Have more come on board?
Good evening, Maurice. It's good to see you again. There's been a wonderful reaction from many Indigenous peoples, and it's like there's been this wellspring. There's a lot of it, and just as when we went to North America, I wasn't aware of this huge history behind the desire for an Indigenous embassy. And I'm hearing from different parts of the world all the time, from Taiwan, for example, and through an Indonesian friend as well. And the Chinese are so excited about this. There are apparently 1 million Chinese Christians who are praying for this embassy. When you think about these networks, it's quite mind-blowing. So there's certainly been a lot of interest from Indigenous peoples. So this is probably a good time to point out that, of course, there are a lot of Indigenous peoples who are anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. And the example in New Zealand, to describe the New Zealand situation, and it's similar to the Native Americans as well, this has developed since I would say the 1960s as part of an an international movement that connected with the Black consciousness movement at the time, the anti-apartheid movement. And it was part of a decolonizing kind of movement. And so there is that strong pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel movement amongst Indigenous peoples as well. But it's not monolithic. You know, there are different persuasions and different parties within indigeneity. It's not homogenous.
Thank you. Debbie, would you like to unmute, please?
Yes. Okay, there's an expression that Jews is news. Why does it seem that everyone looks at the Jews, like more than many of the other things that are going on? I mean, from your perspective.
That's a big question. Well, I think what you're talking about is anti-Semitism, isn't it? It seems to be this ancient hatred that rises up in every generation, and it just looks different at different times of history. And at the moment, it's all around human rights and colonialism. And we've got these phrases of apartheid and ethnic cleansing and genocide and all these accusations. It seems to be the modern kind of manifestation of anti-Semitism. So, of course, that's a huge topic. Why anti-Semitism? It's probably not the platform tonight to deal with that one, but it's a problem. And this is what we're trying to do as Indigenous people who support Israel, is we want to shift and change that narrative in whatever way we can, influence it, and certainly bring influence amongst our communities, which we're trying to do on the various platforms that are available to us. Yeah, so it's up to everybody to stand up for what they believe is true and right, and that's what we're trying to do here at the Indigenous Embassy.
I think that's a sentence that we all echo and that we're all trying to do in our work, and it's something that we can work harder and try and achieve every day. Viviana, would you like to unmute, please?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, look, I've written my question in the chat. I've recently discovered that I'm 100% Jewish DNA. And I've traced it back over 500 years of Jewish heritage in Eastern Europe, in Romania. My family migrated,
Just
made Aliyah
You got to have
two
your
questions, please.
question, Vivian.
Yeah, I'm trying to say, well, my question is, instead of focusing on Israel, because I'm someone who's been forced to move home many times in Australia, shouldn't I be going back to Romania and demanding my heritage property rights after 500, 600 years of living, a family living in Romania? Shouldn't I be focusing my attention on fighting the courts there for my family land that has obviously been taken away from us, not so much by the Nazis, but more so by the communists? That's my question.
Viviana?
Why
Well, I think you're free to do that if that's what you want to do. Yeah, I mean, the focus for us here is about Jewish indigeneity, but I don't know Romania's history. But if you feel that that's something that should be done, then nothing's stopping you, I guess.
Thank you. So, Shoshana, would you like to unmute, please?
Yep, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes. What's your question, please?
Okay, thank you. Yep. First, I just want to applaud the speaker for her work and her erudition. My question is probably unpopular, but are Jews in the diaspora whose parents went directly from the camps into North America considered Indigenous?
So
Are diaspora Jews?
Yeah.
We're not living there.
That's a good question. And we had this question come up in Canada, and one of the Indigenous advocates actually put a challenge to the rabbi there that he needed to start seeing himself as Indigenous. So to give you an example, I don't live in my particular tribal area, the area that I am Indigenous to, but I still see myself as Indigenous to that particular land. And for Māori who live in Australia, and I know there are many, as you will know, there are many there, and living elsewhere in London in particular, they still see Aotearoa as their Indigenous land, because that's the Indigenous land of their people group. That's where their people come from. And there is an aspect where you have to own it for yourself. You have to be active in identifying yourself that way. And the thing is, with Jews, as for Māori, there have been fractures in our identity, right? So for Māori, even though I still live in my country, with colonization, it brought disruption to the culture, so that I didn't grow up hearing my language, for example. For me, I have to relearn that language. And there are all these cultural practices that I didn't grow up with, and many Māori people didn't grow up with because of colonization, because it was taken away from us. For Jewish people, they were kicked out of their land, and so they lost that connection to the land. And so there's that disruption in there, that fracture. So it's up to individual people to regain that, to find that identity for themselves. But you have such a rich heritage, you know, when you think about your celebrations every year, your commemorations, your Passover, Pesach, you know, Shavuot, all these amazing celebrations which are thousands of years old, which connect you to the land and which are actively practiced, even the, you know, weekly Shabbat. These are all practices that tie you to a particular land and which show that you are an Indigenous people. So again, I would just say that it's really up to you as individuals to reclaim that for yourselves if you don't feel Indigenous. Being outside the land, I don't think is an issue, but it's how you identify yourself, and it's something you have to claim for yourself, I believe.
It can be quite paradoxical because we all call Israel our homeland, and by definition, home would be the country you're indigenous to. So it's
Exactly.
just marrying our two different beliefs and identities that we are the indigenous people. It is our home.
That's
Saul,
right.
would you like to unmute, please?
Yeah, thank you very much for a most interesting and informative talk. What I want to ask is, should we not remind those in South Africa wanting to bring a case against Israel that they themselves are in fact colonizers and rather late to be called indigenous, if they call themselves indigenous, in that they came in there, most Africans, in about the 18th century and early 19th century, displacing the Khoi and the San, who were the true indigenous native people on that land.
So we do have a representative of the Khoi people who is one of our envoys for the Indigenous Embassy. Very pleased to say that. Look, I think with South Africa, we have to remember, and I've just listened to a talk tonight from the wonderful Kenneth Michaud. I don't know how to pronounce that properly. You might have heard of him. He's an Israel supporter, and he makes the point that most South Africans support Israel and is really encouraging South Africans to show up for Israel. It's this ANC government. Well, they've actually been turfed out now, but it was the ANC government previous that really pushed this case, and there was a lot of suggestion that there was money involved and the alliance with some of the powers in behind there. So I guess I'm just saying, don't tar all South Africans with that brush. I think it was that ANC government and a minority voice of South Africa, and there are Indigenous tribes there. And I'm very privileged to know people from the Khoi tribe.
Thank you. Dina, would you please unmute?
I can't thank you enough, Dr. Trotter, for raising and for working towards so strongly this excellent initiative. And it seems to me that we need to have more of our Jewish leaders following you and being part of your movement. Can I ask you, do you have a representation of Israelis, Jews from the diaspora, rabbis, leaders that are supporting you now?
Well, we're always looking for people to ally with in the Jewish community. We don't have formal alliances at the moment. We are forming an Israel advisory group. Of course, we're saying Jews are the indigenous people of the land, and it's important that we need an Israel advisory group there, which will actually be made up of Jews and non-Jews. But yes, as I say, we're looking to ally have partnerships with anybody really who wants to hold hands with us and help us and support us on this journey. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Ashley in the chat. What differentiates people being historically indigenous to a land and those that are more recently born in a land?
Well, I think it's important to understand what indigeneity is. It's about the ethnogenesis of a particular people in a land, so how a people group develops, and a people group being indigenous to a particular land. Recent newcomers to a land would not really fall into that category unless he's got a particular example in mind.
I think it comes to the debate about, for instance, Australia is a multicultural country. If you're second, third generation Australia, it's a question of identity. You feel very Australian, but that's the difference between being indigenous to the land and the nationality or the way you feel about your identity.
Yeah, Great. Well, you've explained it well. That's national identity, which is different, separate from indigeneity. So, you know, there are Indigenous Australians who were the first peoples of the land. And I think, you know, first peoples is quite a good guideline. It doesn't always fit, but for the most part, thinking in terms of first peoples works.
We've had a few people in the chat asking a similar theme of questions. One of them was, do you communicate and collaborate with Australian Indigenous leaders like Jacinta Price and Nova Paris? And then we had somebody else in the chat. It would be fantastic to engage with Indigenous Australian communities with your ideas. Maybe you can touch on some of these points.
We really want to extend our work into Australia. We know Norman and Barbara Miller, who are there tonight, and I've reached out to Nova. Jacinta Price, I haven't had contact with, would love to have contact with her. So, you know, if you can put us in touch with these people, we'd really love to do that. Of course, we will be looking for representation from Indigenous Australians in due course as well.
Gary, would you like to unmute, please?
Yep. Sheree, I was in touch with you a few months ago via LinkedIn before you went to Jerusalem, but I didn't follow it up. I'm glad someone else did. I think one of the things that gets in the way of a lot of the leftists who are not religious, not understanding that Jews are a people, we're not Europeans and from wherever else with a religion, where so many leftists, atheists, the way they met religion as kids was a way that they can just decide, no, I'm not going to bother with it. And they think they don't understand that a peoplehood that includes a religion, but not in the way that Western religion is thought of as something you can put on or take off. So
yes,
it's a good there's a question in there about how to.
Well, it's a good point, and I can give a kind of a comparison with Maori culture. Our culture, our stories were handed down to us orally, and a lot of the stories that tell about our history come into this category of mythology. Now, for many Maori, it's not mythology. To them, this is the way it is. But that is all embraced and accepted as part of our culture. These stories, which some would say are mythological stories. So when I look at Jewish culture and you've got your histories that were actually written down, ours are oral or ours are in the carvings, our carving houses, our marae, our meeting houses tell stories. You have yours written down, whether people believe them or not, whether they believe God or not, in God or not. These are the stories that have been handed down as part of your culture. It's your literature, your literary heritage. And so I don't see a problem with that. Even if you're an atheist, you can look at that body of work, whether you think it's true or not true, it's still a huge body of work that is part of your story and part of your culture and part of your heritage. And I think it's really magnificent, actually, the Jewish body of history. I don't know that there's any other culture in the world that has that to the same degree.
Thank you. We might go to Robert if.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Trotter. It's been an excellent talk. And yeah, AJ would love to partner with you in any way we can, and we can certainly put you in touch with Jacinta Price. I had a question about what do you think of the Jewish people adopting some of the things that are being used by other Indigenous people around the world? So, for example, I was in Israel where when they had some foreign dignitaries, they asked them to pay respect to the ancestors of the land. And I've heard Dr. Adler use the phrase, sovereignty never ceded about Israel. So what do you think about adopting some of these quite successful things being done by other Indigenous people around the world?
So give me that example again.
So one example is sort of some of the phrasing, sovereignty never ceded, which is used in Australia, or the welcome to country type things before meetings, those kind of things.
Yeah. I think when you're in a land then you follow protocols of the people of that land. So if I come to Australia, if you come to New Zealand, we will have protocols that, you should try and follow. Likewise, if you go to Australia. But if you're in your land, Israel, as Jewish people, then you have your own protocols, and that is what should set the agenda, as it were. And I saw this when we went to Native America. When we went to America, their protocols around gift giving were quite phenomenal. They give gifts to honor people, and it's just the degree to which they practice this protocol of gift giving. We have gift giving as well as part of our culture, but it's not on the same level as the Native Americans. So going into their culture and seeing the way they do things, we kind of had to adapt in some ways and try and fit in with their cultural practices, which you would do when you go into somebody else's culture. If you come onto a marae in New Zealand, for example, there are very set protocols, and you try not to cross the protocols. And there can be different protocols in different tribes as well. And when you go into a different tribe, then you try and respect their protocols. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, no, that's great. And also, we've had some questions about, have you noticed much change under the New Zealand government in terms of anti-Semitism, Israel policy? What's the situation in New Zealand like?
Well, I would have to say, we had a change of government at the end of last year, and initially it seemed quite positive. But then our last government was very anti-Israel. So, being positive is not saying an awful lot. But in more recent times, it's been more disappointing as the government is getting into its flow, and it's just becoming more political. Feels like just trying to have a say each way, and it's wishy-washy, and it's not making strong statements. And I was very disappointed today to see that we're not going to be designating the Iranian Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization, which is something that they had, when they weren't in government, they said they were going to do, and now they're not going to do it. So on the whole, I'm feeling disappointed, but I have to say it's probably an improvement on our previous government, where you couldn't even actually engage with the foreign minister over Israel.
Speaking of, what is the situation then on the ground? Are you finding that the general public, in Australia, we've had multiple instances of anti-Semitism, graffiti, people are feeling scared to wear their Magen Davids out in the workplace. What is it like on the ground to be Jewish or to be proud and open?
I think it's similar here. I think the Jewish community have found it very difficult, have faced a lot of anti-Semitism, maybe not as extreme as some of the incidences that you've had in Australia, but certainly from what I hear from parents with their children at school, 80% of parents have said their children have had anti-Semitic incidences that they've faced. I have friends who've told me, a friend who's told me his son came home with a black eye, and so it has been very concerning here. What I would say, though, is that in terms of the Palestinian movement, it's very loud and dominating, but I don't think it represents the majority of New Zealanders. Ordinary New Zealanders, when you talk to ordinary New Zealanders, you really get the impression that they support Israel, but they're not vocal about it. It's a quiet support, which is not what we want. We really want people to speak up and show up for Israel. But I think it's like everywhere across the Western world, the anti-Semitism has gone through the roof here, just as it has elsewhere.
And we are so lucky to have people like you, Doctor, to advocate for Israel, to show up, to be vocal, and to be proud that you support Israel and you're willing to do what it takes. So we really, really cannot thank you enough for your support. And please, if you want to join Sheree on her journey, reach out to us. We can facilitate introductions. These causes always need support and help. So please reach out to us, reach out to Dr. Sheree about how you can support, how you can make a difference, because it is a phenomenal cause and we are so pleased to be involved and to support you and grateful for your support. If you have any closing remarks, we're at time. So with that, I'd like to remind everybody that this will be recorded, played on YouTube. You can share with your friends, share this important message. And thank you for your support, everyone who comes online to watch, who supports us, who watches on Facebook Live. We really appreciate it. Dr. Sheree, any closing remarks?
I just want to say thank you, and it's been an honour to have this conversation with you this evening. I look forward to further contact with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.